Good morning, party people. And it's been a hot minute since I've done one of these live, right? Like since I've done one of them live on Twitch. I've been doing a lot of them and just recording them here in the same office using all the same gear, but just not live streaming them on Twitch. Because I had a tendency to do them really at like dark 30 in the morning, way before anybody got in. Like Drop Table says, welcome back to Twitch. Thank you. It's been like a couple of months. In November 22nd, or November of 22, but it was like November 22nd, ended up being the same date, I decided to, and I planned this long in advance, stop doing live things on my calendar. It coincided with the last class taught by the live class season pass. And I wanted to have nothing on my live calendar for like 3 months straight from November 22nd until February 22nd. I didn't want to have anything on my calendar that said I had to be at a specific place at a specific time. Because I wanted to step back after I finished off the live class season passes. I wanted to step back and think about, okay, what is it that I want to teach next? Like, I want to be able to record new training classes, build new written recorded material, but I didn't know what I wanted it to be on. I had a few different ideas for stuff. And so I had to take some time to step back and think, all right, where's the industry going? What is it that I want to learn? What is it that I want to share? What do I find exciting? Because, man, I'll tell you what, it really sucks to try and teach something that you're not passionate about. General Concavity says, last time I saw you, I had the Keychron. I still do have that in the closet, actually. But it was really uncomfortable for me to pop my wrists up. That keyboard is so freaking thick. Oh, hey, Jim. Good to see you. And I still adore that keyboard. I like it better than the Apple ones, but it was so freaking thick. And so I'm looking at Keychron made a newer, thinner one. The other thing that's really cool about the Apple keyboards is that the fingerprint sensor that's built in. So when you want to like buy stuff online, and I just buy a disturbing amount of things online. If you want to buy stuff online, it's really easy with the Apple Card. You just put your finger on there and it authenticates you and does all that cool stuff. So I do like that a lot, but I'm mixed. I go back and forth about whether or not I want to go back to a Keychron. So so I figured I'm going to do an office hours live here. I'm also experimenting with those of you who were here a long time ago, months ago. Elphorus, good. Wren. Okay, so it's funny, just since you're here. So Wren, right now there are like 4 open pull requests on the first responder kit, and yours is still one of them. And I kept going back to it, and because you checked in the file, this is not your fault, but because you checked in the file with a different name, it made it hard to merge the pull request. Basically would have had to copy SPBlitz index into another name. And for some reason, that kept giving me just enough of a barrier where I was like, I'll do that next release. I will do that this pull release, or the next monthly release. I'm trying to do one for January because there's a tweak on SPBlitz lock that we need to get out. But I'll have that out and credit to you in the release notes. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to recheck it in or anything like that. But I just wanted to say thank you again for the pull request and for the idea too. I mean, it's long overdue that we do that. Those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, so Wren submitted a pull request for SPBlitz index. SPBlitz index always used mental health terms. Long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, when Kendra and I were working on SPBlitz index, Kendra did all the work, to be really clear. Kendra said, I need a way to explain how indexing is a little different than normal SPBlitz warnings. With normal SPBlitz warnings, we tell you, you can't do this, you shouldn't do this, go fix this. But we wanted something a little more analog for SPBlitz index. Like, hey, a little of this is okay, but we're concerned if you have a lot of it. Like if all your indexes are, 100 columns wide or whatever it was. It's okay if you do it every now and then, but if you do it on a regular basis, you probably need to seek professional help. And my first reaction was like, oh, it's like going to my therapist. When I go to my therapist, it's okay if I'm a little bit of a hoarder. It's a problem when it starts to take over your life or when you're a kleptomaniac or whatever that was. So we put in a lot of mental health terminology into the version of SPBlitz index. We called you indexophobic or a hoarder or whatever. And over time, I mean, it was a funny thing initially, and I think it worked well to tell the story 10 years ago or whenever it was that we started it. These days, it requires more of an explanation than anything else. It's not intuitive for people. Plus, it's kind of not great language. It's not great to bring up mental health terms around databases, things that might trigger people for other unrelated reasons. So we wanted to pull it back and just go, oh, let's strip out all of those mental health type terminologies and make it really easy and more approachable for people, more friendly, more inclusive. It was a great idea. I need to start my little question recorder for PollGab. I always forget to do this, so I'll start to record questions because now it's time to answer y'all's questions. So the way that these usually work is that I take questions from the audience. You can put in questions at the URL here. I'm trying something a little different with this particular episode. I'm going to edit down the video. I'm going to do a portrait version of the video and upload some of the answers to TikTok and try and see how that works. Because I was thinking about, all right, how do I break down some of this content for shorter form videos, Instagram stories, and so forth. So let's go take a look at what the first highly voted question is. So the top voted question, and it's a little wordy, when I'm moving new physical servers with virtual disks that are claimed to be better, replicas are showing super slow read queues. What is the importance of block size across replicas? Anything we configure? So what this question really is it's a laundry list of things are slow, where do I start? Where do I start? Wait stats. Anytime that I'm approaching a SQL Server and I'm trying to figure out why things are slow, I want to ask SQL Server what it's waiting on. That's why it's like the first thing that comes out of SP Blitz first, that cleverly named tool that's supposed to be the first one you run when you deal with performance diagnostics. Start with wait stats, and when you're dealing with availability groups like this question's about, you want to run it on each of the replicas too. You want to find out what your sync secondaries are waiting on, because maybe they're waiting on storage, maybe they're waiting on CPU, you name it. Always start with wait stats. Now, the question has a bunch of other things too, like how should I set things across different replicas? I'm going to again take a step back and go, everything should be the same. When you're dealing with availability groups, you want everything to be the same, because if you're going to fail over to it, it needs to perform the same as production, right? Maybe it won't have the same CPU count or the same memory size when it's running in DR. Maybe you're going to shut it down and add more CPUs or add more memory when it's time to fail over. But from a configuration standpoint, everything about those replicas should be absolutely identical. The more you start to change them, the more you're going to run into performance problems where you go, I don't understand why this one's different. Well, it's because you set it up differently, dummy. That's the whole point of that. Next up, Chris asks, do you have any resources or tips on a new DBA needing to inventory their servers, databases, etc. as a company? I want to start documenting, then I have zero physical documentation. When you're thinking about documenting database servers, the first question you want to ask yourself is, who's reading it? Who's going to read the documentation that you write? If you look around the company and no one else is going to read that documentation, if you ask them, hey, if I had 30 pages worth of documentation about our database servers, would you read them? If the overwhelming answer is no, what are you writing the documentation for? If it's for yourself so that you can go back later and say, how is that server configured? You know what? Documentation is going to be out of date anyway when you go to ask the question. It's not to say you shouldn't control changes. It's not to say you shouldn't save an original state of a server so that you can get back to it. But what I find is documentation doesn't really get me there. Writing a documentation of here are the trace flags that are installed on this server and here's why doesn't really get me there. So if you want, you could output the contents of SP Blitz with check server info equals 1 set to true, or check server info equals 1, and save that to a table somewhere. But otherwise, make sure you're writing the documentation for a person and then ask them what they need to know. Next up, we have Mike asks, I've never used a Mac or Azure Data Studio. Will Mac or Azure Data Studio be enough to perform my DBA duties? No. 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 Saying no so many times I had to take a break and refresh my throat. No, Azure Data Studio is designed to help people who are developing new code, troubleshooting existing code, for example. They are not really management utilities in the same way that Management Studio, get the name? It's really clever. Management Studio is meant to do. There are still things that you can only do inside of Management Studio that you can't do in Azure Data Studio. So it's not that I don't like Azure Data Studio. It's totally fine. But if you're going to do server management, you probably want to focus on things like Management Studio and PowerShell for that matter. Next up, TK Bruin asks, what would you say are the top 2 or 3 functions or features that SQL Server's been adding over the last couple of years that have been the most transformative in terms of business benefits? Oh, what have been the most features that were the most transformative in terms of business benefits? I can't think offhand for business benefits for SQL Server over the last few releases. That's not to say Microsoft didn't want it. They did. The idea behind, for example, putting machine learning in the database was that it would bring business capabilities that you didn't have before. But it turns out that when people want to do machine learning, they probably don't want to do it on the box that costs $7,000 a core for SQL Server Enterprise Edition. They would much rather do it on the servers that cost, carry the one, $0. There's a whole lot of open source machine learning tools, R, Python, all kinds of things that you could use. And you don't have to run them on the database server itself. You can call them from the database server if you want to do that, but you're really pretty much better off calling those from the application. I will say there's something cool that's been business changing outside of SQL Server, and that's Azure Data Factory. Azure Data Factory makes so much sense for ETL work, and it doesn't have to be Azure Data Factory. You could use AWS Glue. There's all kinds of things that you could use for ETL. But in the same way that people wanted to learn machine learning, move machine learning out of the expensive database server, you know what? They also want to move ETL out of the expensive SQL Server. And at the end of the day, SQL Server Information Services is hella expensive. It's really $2,000 a core for standard, $7,000 a core for enterprise. It's also very peaky, burst load like work, which is the perfect use for the cloud. You don't want to pay by the hour for some server that just sits around doing nothing all day long. You want to pay by the job that you run, and you want to have near limitless capacity whenever that job does need to run. Azure Data Factory makes so much sense there. I'm a huge, massive fan of that. Next up, Ted Stryker says, do you have any tips for doing things like OpenQuery? Yes, don't do that. If you went to your doctor and said, Doctor, every time I punch myself between the legs, it hurts. Do you have any tips on how I can punch myself between the legs more effectively? Don't do that. That's not what high performance is all about. Why would you hurt yourself by running queries, querying over to a different SQL server? Go connect to the SQL server that has the data that you're looking for. Yeah, but I just really want to punch. Just want to punch. So the tip I would give you is punch someone else between the legs. Task this to someone else. If you believe that it really needs to be done quickly, give that work to someone else, and they won't be able to figure out how to make that go fast either, but at least then the pain will be on them instead of you. Next up, Roger Murdock asks, what have been the worst file group design strategies that you've seen in the world? One of my favorite ones was there was a data warehouse designer who believed that every user of the data warehouse should have their own file group. Every user should have their own file group so that when they created their own tables, they would be isolated in little containers separate from everybody else. Okay, but it was all the same storage, and they had hundreds of users, And next thing you know, they had thousands of files inside their database. And in every file, they had empty space because you can't really fill up files to 100% capacity and not run into problems with stuff like auto growth. So these users would keep putting just a little bit of data into their file group. And then they ended up with all this empty space across these thousands of files. And a poor soul that I know had to be tasked with moving all of these tables from these individual stupid little file groups. Because, of course, too, what's going to happen? Somebody's going to move on from the company, but we're still going to need their tables because other people are relying on them. So this person had to recombine all of the tables from all these different file groups into one main file group. And of course, all that was fully logged activity, affected DR. It was just absolutely terrible. Could not believe that. Chandwich asks, hey, Brent, I completed your fundamentals and mastering courses. Woohoo! That's awesome. Congratulations. But I haven't applied it all to my job yet. How would you recommend that I show it off on my resume? Okay, I'm going to say something really vain here. Just put it on your resume. Finished Brent Ozar's fundamentals and mastering courses and keep your receipts. When you go through the course, you can mark each module off as completed, and there's a report you can run to go and check to show, hey, here's all the modules that I finished, or that I have 100% completion across all these courses. Keep that around because people may eventually ask you, hey, where's your proof that you did this? You can also, when you finish the courses, because we can see in behind the scenes on the video side, when you've finished watching all of the courses, email us and you can get a completion certificate for those too as well. But yeah, just put it directly on your resume. The reason why I say it's kind of vain is a lot of people in the industry know my name already. So you can, when you say, oh, I finished Brent Ozar's mastering courses, they'll be like, oh, I always wanted to do that too. And then that gives you that credibility. Next up, Drew says, when the default invocation of SP who is active takes a few minutes to produce a result set, what's the first thing you look for in those results? When it takes that long, you don't look at queries. You have a server level problem. Go look at wait stats across the entire server. Attend my class, How I Use the First Responder Kit, and I'd show you how to work through from a server level down, what to look for, where the server's bottleneck is, because odds are it's not just one query that's doing it. Odds are you have a whole forest of problems. Next up, Nick12 says, hi, Brent, how's your week? I don't have a lot of complaints. Well, I do have one complaint. Those of you who've been watching my Instagram or TikTok know that my backyard renovation is going to hell in a handbasket. It's been weeks now that months really, that my backyard has been unusable because I've got a contractor who's not doing what they're supposed to do when they're supposed to do it. So we've been waiting and waiting and waiting. Things will start. They'll make just a little bit of progress. I can't get too mad about that, but the problem is we have a little dog, Benny, it's like Beanie Baby, Beanie or Benny, depending on how you pronounce it. And he's used to having a doggy door where he could just go straight out the back door and pee and poop and have a good old time. But unfortunately now he does not have that capability. He can't go out in the backyard on his own because it's a disaster zone. So I have to walk him like 3, 4, 5 times a day. And it took a while for us walking him before he finally stopped pooping in the home theater. We have a home theater. It's very dark, like you would expect. The walls are painted black. There's blackout curtains over the windows. So he would go, and it's carpeted. And so he would go in there where it's nice and dark and no one could see, and he would poop in there. And we would go open the door. The door was always open. We would go open and turn on the lights to go sit down. We're like, oh, God, he pooped in here again. So at least we've broken him of that habit, but I'll be really happy when that's over. Mr. Raj, I see that you posted a question. Make sure that you read the instructions here on the screen. I see that it's your first time chatting in here, but post that question right there at that URL on the screen and we can go from there. Chat is totally fine. You're welcome to use chat. It's just that I don't answer questions out of the chat. The questions go into PollGab, makes it easier for me to track and not lose track of stuff. So Nick12 says, is there a way for the Halloween, or a way to avoid the eager spool for the Halloween problem in a single update Okay, so are you trying to micromanage update queries? The first thing that I would ask when you're trying to performance tune the The first thing that I would say when you're trying to performance tune an update query is how often does this run? Is this something that runs all the time? In which case there's a different set of performance tuning that I would do. It typically involves lowering the number of indexes, making sure you have as little overhead as possible. Because things like those spools, you'll have a spool for every index. I want to minimize the number of indexes that I have. Or is it something that is only going to happen once? Like if you're altering a table and you're changing a nullable column to not null, for example. Are there ways that you can go about tuning that? That one for me typically is batching, working through and say 3,000-4,000 rows at a time, nibbling off the changes. In my mastering query tuning class, I've got a short module, it's about 20 minutes long, talking about how you accomplish big changes to the database using batching and nibbling those off in as small chunks as possible. And we'll do one more question. We'll take one out of the most recent queue just because Wren is in here, so I'll go ahead and grab Wren's question. Wren says, would you recommend using a surrogate key similar to a row ID, even if there is a usable unique PK in a table? If the business is the ones telling you, trust me, this column will always be unique, they're lying. Maybe it's true today, but it's probably not going to be true 30 days from now. The example I use all the time is United States Social Security number. In theory, that's supposed to be unique. In practice, it is not unique. There are people who share the same Social Security number. And of course, there are fraud cases where you have to peel back later, where there was someone who's supposed to be using that SSN, and there are other people who are fraudulently using that same SSN, but I need to identify their transactions separately. If the business is telling me that, yes, trust me, it's always going to be unique, I don't trust them. I'd still rather use an auto-numbered identity column. But if the data tells me, if I look at this data and I go, oh, you know what, there's no way that this could ever possibly duplicate, and I think I can prove it, then I'm okay with that. And I'll give you an example of a GUID. I had a client who their cash registers generated GUIDs, and then that's how we identified transactions. And I was like, sure, if you want to use that as a primary key, a clustered index even, which is a whole separate discussion. But if you want to use that as a primary key on the table and you can guarantee they're never going to collide, I'm fine with it, especially given that the sheer number of transactions that they had made it impractical to add another column just for uniqueness when they'd been operating for decades and they'd never had a GUID collision. So there you go. All right, so there we go. We went through a whole bunch of questions there. Let's see how long. Oh, we've been going for about 20 minutes. I usually try and keep these broadcasts relatively short. I could sit here and freaking talk for hours and it wouldn't bother me at all. But I find that people have a tendency to watch like 10 to 15 minutes at a time and then they bail out and go on and do something else. So we've got like 20 minutes worth of answers inside there. I will do, now that I've got my infrastructure set back up again for Twitch, oh my gosh, it had been a while and I had all kinds of things that weren't working. Like my sound effects. Cool. Finally have my buttons again. I use these little, oh, Renegade Larson, good to see you. I use little stream decks here that have all kinds of little sound decks. All right. Sound buttons in there, or push that back off. All kinds of sound effects and stuff. So that whole setup wasn't working, and I had to figure out how to get that back up again. But now that I've got all that infrastructure back in, I'll probably be poking my head in here every now and then for the next couple of days and see how this works. Plus, now I got to go try editing these videos for TikTok and go see how that works. So thanks for hanging out with me, everybody, and I will see y'all on the next office hours. Where's my stop button? There it is. Adios.